In the last video, we talked about how the Europeans had come to conquer Africa, and mainly the British, but others involved. How the Europeans had come to conquer Africa. We already talked about how they conquered India, and then we also talked about how they justified it. The idea of the white man's burden, the idea that they were conquering people and doing so for their own good. They were dragging people to education and civilization. We also said, though, that the reality is it was greed, and that greed is going to lead to terrible abuses, whether it's famines or India, or cutting people's hands off in Central Africa. So terrible abuses are taking place, and the justification made sense to them at that time period in their context. But today, we hopefully can be aware that that justification, the idea of the white man's burden, is an incredibly racist mindset. So pretty much all about this is just terrible. Let's move on to imperialism in other places. And yes, I know this map is terrible. It's a terrible map. It's got Greenland twice. I get it. Ignore that. But we're talking about basically how the rest of the world is going to start getting conquered. Not just Africa, but now the United States of America expanding into different places. Eventually, even the Philippines. So moving on, talking about just a few other wrapping up places. U.S. expansion post-Civil War. We're going to talk more about the United States of America in a later chapter when we talk about 19th century Latin America, specifically Mexico. So we're going to touch more on this stuff later. Right now, just kind of going over the main points. Right before the Civil War, the United States of America had fought the Mexican-American War. The United States of America during that war won, and actually at one point basically conquered all of Mexico, and then they gave half of it back. And we'll talk about why they did that in later chapters. It had a lot to do with racist mindsets of the time. But they're going to conquer Mexico. They take half of the territory, but only about 5% of the population. So about 50% of Mexico, but about 5% of the population. This area was very sparsely populated at the time. So this area all becomes part of the United States of America. So America conquers for originally 13 colonies, and we take over these regions here, the Louisiana Purchase, and then we conquer all this land from Mexico. We make agreements with England over this area here. But we conquer all of this from Mexico. We even buy some, that's more of an APUS thing, but we even buy some later on from Mexico. And all of this now is the United States of America. We're from coast to coast, from sea to shining sea, right? Um, you think we were done, conquering? We were born out of imperialism. Colonies are an imperialistic thing. It just made sense that we continue that policy going on, and so America grows to become an empire. Now, where we added all of these places in, when we added them in, we added them as states, right? So they became equal parts of the United States of America. And that was actually a big thing in history. We weren't the British Empire. That's the way we viewed ourselves. We started out as colonies, but now when we expand, we're not taking colonies. Ohio didn't become a colony when we became part of the United States. It became an equal state, a part of the United States. And we did that from coast to coast. Things are going to start changing. First, we buy Alaska from Russia. This was originally called Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. Seward was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State. He oversaw purchasing these things. He believed that the United States of America should conquer Canada and Mexico and all of North America. And he believed that taking Alaska would help us get this part of Canada eventually, that this part here would become part of the United States as well, too. So we'd be boxing them in, essentially. But originally it was viewed as ridiculous, a folly. They made fun of Seward for purchasing it. Later on, of course, Alaska became an incredibly important part of the United States of America, especially important during Cold War, especially important concerning oil and natural wildlife and things. So, anyways, seemed stupid at the time. Today it's that's a pretty good decision, is how we view it. But Alaska joins the United States of America. Well, okay, now we've conquered lands over here, and the rest of this is all British North America, and eventually Canada. Where else are we going to go next? Hawaii. So the next place people are going to start looking, and we'll talk more about this later on in later chapters, and you'll learn a lot more about this in APUS. But America starts moving into Hawaii. They want to move into moving too far. They want to move into Hawaii because it gives them access to Asia, and we'll talk more of that when we get to Asian chapters and stuff. But it's halfway through the Pacific Ocean. It has a natural harbor, Pearl Harbor, which is an easy way of getting ships to land, essentially, getting them really close up to the land. So it's a natural harbor, huge. Had people that can be converted. This is how they're going to justify it. So people who can be converted to Christianity. So people in Hawaii didn't have Jesus yet, so they were going to go convert them. So it's for the betterment of people. And then also resources. There were certain things in Hawaii that don't grow in the other continental United States of America. So Pineapples were a luxury good at this time period. Pineapples grow in Hawaii. Coffee, I believe, still to this day, Hawaii is the only state in the union that grows coffee, outside of a greenhouse. Uh, Sugar, of course, and other fruit items. You're going to learn more about it in APUS, but Hawaii's conquered. One of the guys who oversees the conquering of Hawaii, his name is Sanford Dole, like Dole Fruit Packing Company. He's part of that same family. So yeah, greed over resources is the main drive, but also we're going to justify it by saying we're white man's burden. They have to drag people to civilization, and then also militaristic reasons, Pearl Harbor, which is going to let America have better access to the rest of the world. These areas we add in as states. So Alaska and Hawaii, they'll eventually become states, even though not till the 20th century, but they will eventually become states. However, during this time period, there's a giant shift in American policy. After the Civil War, we fight the Spanish American War. The Spanish American War, we fight against Spain, and we do this solely to take over their lands and territories. These areas that we add in will never become states, just possessions. So you've probably heard of Puerto Rico and Guam and America's Samoa. In a weird way, not quite conquering outright, but Cuba. We had a lot of say and power over Cuba for a long time period. These were all areas that Spain used to own, and we take them from Spain and never add them into states. The Philippines. We will conquer all of these places and just own them as colonies and territories. This is usually seen as a turning point in American history, because at first we were very anti-imperialistic. We fought a revolution, and we were against the imperial control of the British. This is the turning point where now, okay, we conquered the Hawaiians at gunpoint, the bayonet constitution. Like, we weren't, we killed the Native Americans, but people justified it by saying, well, these new states joined in and became equal parts. Now they're not equal parts. Now this is where people say we went from being the United States of America to being really the American Empire, and that's an argument many historians have made. The United States is seen as a growing imperialistic power, and we're going to talk more about that when we get to the Latin American section. All right, imperialism in Central Asia, specifically Afghanistan is what we're talking about here. British, French, and Russians were all competing for Central Asia, specifically around the Afghani region. France drops out after Napoleon. He focused almost exclusively on Europe. We'll talk more about that later because he's going to drop out of Haiti and places as well too. So he drops out and focuses more on Europe. So now we're down to our Russia and the French. Sorry, Russia and the British. Russia is going to continually try to conquer these areas, try to gobble up more land, and push into the British areas of India. The British usually referred to this as the Great Game, and the Rudyard Kipling book Kim is written about this time period. The Great Game, this is how they viewed it. The Russian versus the British, and they had different spies, and they would use different Afghani people against each other and play the different clans of people against each other, and they viewed it as a game, like a chessboard. Okay, that's how they talked about it. That's how they printed it in the newspapers. There are books written about it as this great game. But this game is human lives, and they're playing people against each other and creating problems and creating strife that's going to exist all the way up to this current day. And they're doing it for who can get the most land, on the other side of the world. It's just a game to them, all these people's lives. Afghanistan, by the way, is oftentimes considered a place where empires go to die. It's the extent of Alexander's empire largely. It's the last place the British and the Russian empires are going to go trying to conquer places. Afghanistan, some historians have called it the place where empires go to die. Of course, later on in the 1980s, the USSR, disastrous strike into Afghanistan, is one of the leading causes, not the only cause, but one of the leading causes of the end of the USSR, the Soviet Union. So be careful if you're planning to invade Afghanistan. Southeast Asia, a little bit more complicated because there's so many different places to talk about. The Spanish and then the Americans conquer the Philippines. So originally, we already talked about this before, the Spanish took the Philippines island by island. Well, America shows up during the Spanish-American War and takes it from the Spanish, keeps the Philippines to themselves until 1947, I think. It was after World War II. The Dutch conquered Indonesia. We talked about this before. Dutch East Indies areas down here. We talked about that before, largely for coffee. We talked about Java and things. Sumatra, these words we think of being synonymous with coffee during this time period. Eventually, oil will also be discovered. British established a presence in many different places, especially around India, Bangladesh. We already talked about that. The French are going to take this region over here. So Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. This region here all becomes French, and the Vietnamese are going to be fighting off against the French repeatedly. That's going to lead into things like the Vietnam War later on. Encouraged conversion to Christianity, oftentimes forcing conversions to Christianity in many parts of these regions. One cultural tidbit you may have ever heard of before. If you go to a Vietnamese restaurant and you order a banh mi, as a common Vietnamese sandwich, basically, you see it in a lot of Vietnamese American restaurants. It's a sandwich on a French baguette roll, and this is because of the legacy of the French conquering this region and controlling it for over 100 years. Thailand, remember Ethiopia and Liberia? We talked about that with Africa. Thailand, which back then is the Kingdom of Siam, was largely the only nation to largely be independent during this time period in Southeast Asia. So how could they do this? Well, basically they would play the English and the French off each other, make agreements, make alliances with them, and say, oh, we would love to give you more territory, France, but our friends the English wouldn't like it, and then they would do the exact same thing to the English. So, oh, we would love to give you more rule or have you, have more power in our society, but the French, our friends the French would be against it. And so playing off the fear of England and France, two European powers going to war with each other in the area, they played that fear off of the Europeans and managed to maintain independence. So Thailand is the only nation to remain independent to this day. They still have a monarchy. They have some problems, definitely, in Thailand. So it's not saying it's perfect in land of milk and honey, all right? But during this time period, they maintain their monarchy. They still have a king to this day. Sort of a weird thing. It seems like a holdover. Like, you can't insult the king in Thailand. It's illegal. Anyways, they still have that older system, and it's kind of a legacy of this. They never got their traditional systems destroyed by European powers. All right, so results. We're almost done. Results of the 19th century. So economic legacy of imperialism, well, mercantilism, just now on steroids, and backed by industrialization. So colonized states encouraged exploiting natural resources, usually single resource exporting nations. So rather than build manufacturing centers in India or throughout Africa or anywhere else, they are just used for pulling resources from colonies and taking them to the mother countries. Mercantilism, mercantilism, mercantilism. It's basically the exact same thing. But now it's just the backbone of new imperialism. This is also, we've talked about this before, going to encourage a dependency on the imperial power. If you were India, you could not by law make your own clothes. You made the cotton, you made the dyes, but you couldn't make your own clothes. And so if you wanted to buy clothing, you had to buy British-made clothing coming out of British factories. So there's this dependency on the imperial power. You needed the mother country now in order to survive. We're going to talk more about this later in the course when we talk about like Gandhi. Gandhi was from India, made his own clothes out of protest, but he also, when he went to England, at one point he went and met with British textile factory workers and said, like, my fight's not with you, but we're all involved in this together. Anyways, we'll talk more about that stuff later. So a huge economic legacy of all of these countries around the world, places in Africa still to this day, who they focus on one resource that they export to industrialized powers. Very little industry in many of these countries. India, just the last couple of decades, is really starting to turn that around. Most places around the world that are conquered during this time period will not be so lucky. All right. You probably heard this quote before: the sun never sets on the British Empire, because during this time period, the British Empire will conquer, here's the pink part here, will conquer about 25% of the world. So literally the sun never set. As the sun rose and fell, it would always shine somewhere on something that England owned. So leading up right before World War I, that's why 1914 shows up a lot, the British Empire was massive. The French Empire was massive. There are a couple of independent places still left, but Africa and most of Southeast Asia is totally gobbled up. China looks independent and powerful. The Ottomans look independent and powerful, but we're going to find out that that's not the case. And this is kind of what the world's looking like. Here are just a few of the main players, the European powers during this time period, but just their own colors, so nobody else. Here you can see the British Empire. It's a little easier to see. They're the red, so monstrous amount of land that they own. Still own the Falklands. Fought a war over that in the 80s. Still own the Falkland Islands. But the British Empire is this massive empire. The French Empire, not as big, but still pretty big. Still pretty big empire. And then of course Germany. They only have a handful of places around the world. So Germany became a country later. As a result, they are going to get less territory. Once again, that's going to be a possible contributing factor to World War I. This is a fun map here. Countries that England has not attacked at one point in time. I feel like this chapter is very anti-England. I mean, they were the world leader for this sort of stuff, but these are places where English troops have not invaded at one point in time. Um, you can tell a lot of them are landlocked. That's kind of that's a big part of it. So, anyways, England recap. England conquers most of India and half of Africa. Other countries scramble to keep up. The desire for resources because of the industrial age and new markets drives this new expansion. New technology allowed it to happen. Without the industrial age, the industrial age allowed it to happen. The industrial age made it happen. Those it really comes together. Industrialization and imperialism are linked. Hand in hand. So this new technology made all the conquering possible, and finally, the world is mostly gobbled up during this time period. No more deep dark Africa. The world became a lot smaller, and it became smaller out of European greed.